my name is Nick Carter. I'm a general partner. Hello, my name is Nick Carter. I'm a general partner and co-founder of Island Ventures. I'm here to talk about Bitcoin's energy dynamics, why it consumes so much energy, and what we can expect from it in the future as the protocol evolves. This is a very contentious topic, and I think when the facts are considered, it's demystified. We can become much more comfortable with its energy usage. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So the first thing, a key premise for this entire discussion is that Bitcoin has a claim on some of the Earth's resources.
At Track, we empower all those who make music, and throughout the journey,
value has an apolitical consider its sort of energy outlay. So as I said, Bitcoin's security and reliability derives from proof of work. And so the costliness of the ledger is what links this digital system to the physical world. The fact that there are actual physical costs associated with creating new ledger entries, that links the analog and the digital. An analogy here you could consider would be Mesopotamian clay tablets from 3000 BC, where these accounting relationships would be inserted onto wet clay, and X owes Y, Z amounts of barley, for instance, and that relationship is described on the clay tablet, and then it's set outside in the sun to dry. And once the tablet is dried, that relationship is forever encoded. It can't be changed. It can't be reversed. Bitcoin blocks the accumulation of computational work in progressive Bitcoin blocks, gives you a similar kind of assurance. Once a transaction has occurred in the Bitcoin ledger, once sufficient blocks have been mined, that transaction is assumed to be final. And so in the case of the clay tablets, it's the sun's energy which is providing you that kind of finality and calcifying the ledger and effectively making it robust and immutable. In the case of Bitcoin, it's computational work which does that same thing. Now, a lot of people say, well, why can't we just strip the proof of work out of Bitcoin and insert a system like proof of stake? Well, if you were to do that in proof of stake, you would create influence proportional to the number of coins held. In the case of Bitcoin, that would make these large custodians, banks, effectively, that control lots of coins on behalf of users. It would make them the stewards of the network. It would give them effective control. And unfortunately, it's the case today that many, a large fraction of all the outstanding Bitcoins are controlled by these custodians. And so if you were to eliminate the proof of work process and impose something like proof of stake or delegate control to these third-party validators with a lot of influence, you would lose the nice assurances. You would lose the decentralization of the network effectively. So as far as we know, proof of work provides pretty unique assurances that aren't recaptured by any alternative system. So as I mentioned before, proof of work has a couple different functions. One of them is to mediate the initial issuance of new Bitcoins. It's interestingly the fact that historically, the vast majority of Bitcoin's energy expenditure derives from this issuance. So miners are compensated in two ways. One is through the collection of new units of Bitcoin, and then the second is through fees that users attach to transactions. But historically, the issuance of new units of Bitcoin has dominated their revenue. It's been over 90% of their revenue historically, with transaction fees being much more minor. And so when you think about the energy consumption of the Bitcoin system, this is really critical because you have to decompose transactional intensity from miner revenue and hence energy spend. It's not the case that adding more transactions will dramatically increase the energy expenditure of the Bitcoin network, as a lot of people mistakenly believe. Most of the energy consumption is really a function of the price of Bitcoin and, of course, the value of that new issuance that miners are collecting. That's really what's going to drive the energy consumption over the next few years, not the number of transactions. Bitcoin can scale up the number of transactions or the value of transactions without really having a linear proportional effect on the amount of energy that miners are consuming. So it's really, in the near and medium term, much more a function of the price of Bitcoin and the value of the new reward that miners are incurring. And this is kind of analogous to gold, again. You shouldn't think of Bitcoin's energy dynamics as analogous to something like Visa. You should think of it as similar to gold, where the vast majority of the energy expended by gold production, manufacturing, extraction, has to do with mining the gold, pulling it out of the ground and refining it. It has much less to do with moving the gold on trucks or boats or anything like that. It's kind of similar with Bitcoin. Most of the energy outlay in Bitcoin's case is a function of the initial creation of Bitcoins. And so that's a key thing to remember, because gold is this useful commodity that people use to store their wealth outside the confines of the state. The extraction of gold is kind of tolerated, even if it's not particularly ecological. And same thing with Bitcoin. The production of Bitcoin is, still, yields and provides us with a system which is of value to society. And so it's still, something that we should accommodate effectively. Now, let's just sort of set the table and actually look at some of the numbers here. So as of today, and there is some uncertainty with all these numbers, a lot of them are estimates. We can't have perfect direct knowledge of all these things because miners are kind of hard to get data from. It's this global set of entities that we can't necessarily triangulate all of who they are. But based on the kind of state-of-the-art knowledge we have today, Bitcoin miners consume about 1/4% of all the world's electricity and about 1/10 of 1% of all the world's energy production, because the world produces a lot more energy than it does mere electricity. And so that's kind of where we are. And whether you think that's really high or really low has to do with your view of sort of the merits of Bitcoin, whether it's a worthwhile thing or not. Now, in terms of the actual composition of the energy inputs, that gets much more tricky to assess because we have to determine whether miners are actually using renewable or non-renewable sources. It's kind of hard to know, right? It's difficult to just ask the miners. So the various estimates we have historically, Cambridge in 2020 ascertained that miners were around 39% renewable. More recent studies, the Bitcoin Mining Council, which is this group of North American and other miners, came out with some disclosures earlier this year, and they found that within that sample, the sustainability of miner operations was around 67%. If you combine that with a conservative assumption for the default energy mix for the world for the out-of-sample data, you get a figure of around 46% sustainable. Now, sustainable means renewable plus nuclear in this instance. And so that's probably better than the global average grid. Now, it's, again, a lot of that is guesswork, and we won't really know what the true sustainability of Bitcoin mining is until we get a better idea of where miners are. But our best guess is that Bitcoin is responsible for around 50 megatons of CO2 emissions per year, or around 1/10 of 1% of the world's emissions. Now, what does this actually mean? I mean, what does this compare to? So you can compare it to individual small countries, as is very commonly done, or you can understand that the world is this sort of highly globalized place, and that for the most part, we outsource our industrial capacity to one or two major countries, which account for the vast majority of sort of energy production and consumption. So Bitcoin's current energy usage is around 0.7% of China's energy production and between 1% to 2% of America's. And so it just really depends, how you want to compare it to the global consumers of energy. Bitcoin's energy footprint is 12 times smaller than always-on devices in U.S. households. It's 15 times less than electricity lost in transit globally every year. And now I think industry level comparisons are much more elucidating than country levels, because Bitcoin is not a country, it's an industry, right? It's an industry that provides monetary assurances, transactions, and savings. And so, this industry analysis is not that commonly done because typically, as far as policy is concerned, we're much more concerned with, well, what's the nature of the grid? How sustainable is the grid? But you can certainly look at individual sources of energy consumption, and you can compare them to Bitcoin if you want. So there's all sorts of numbers here. Bitcoin is, slightly less than the amount of energy consumed just by domestic tumble dryers globally. And of course, a tumble dryer is a discretionary thing. You can always dry your clothes on the line if you want, but it improves our quality of life. So we accept the fact that it consumes some energy. Bitcoin compares favorably with the energy used by copper mining, zinc mining, gold mining. Those all, as far as we can tell, have a greater energy impact. Now, that's not to say that those industries aren't useful. I mean, they provide, genuinely useful metals. This is just to contextualize Bitcoin so you can compare it to other industry level uses of energy. And a lot of these industries, whether it's refrigeration, air conditioning, heating, tumble dryers, washing machines, they massively improve our quality of life. So we don't often think that critically about the energy requirements of those industries because they brought us into modernity. I mean, they represent the trappings of civilization. Air conditioning meant that we could live in hotter places and just live more comfortably. So we don't regret the energy that's used on them, the same way that we shouldn't regret the energy used for this novel monetary transmission technology. This is just the mark of civilizational progress, obtaining more energy and then putting it to use in sort of efficient sources that make our lives better. So just to summarize that section, I mean, the perceived merit of an application's energy consumption is really ultimately a function of your own subjective view of that application's utility, right? And so if you don't believe a certain application has utility, you're going to believe that the energy associated with it is a waste. And certainly a lot of people don't believe that gold has a role in modern society. Certainly many people don't believe that Bitcoin does. But things like gold is a means of storing your wealth outside the banking system, outside the state. Equivalently, so is Bitcoin, in a way that's has completely differentiated qualities from these other monetary systems. So to the extent Bitcoin has utility, to the extent we acknowledge it has utility, its energy consumption becomes much more tractable and something that we can get more comfortable with. Satoshi, mentioned this before, saying, gold mining is a waste, but gold itself facilitates these new transactions that wouldn't be possible without it. So it's not a net waste. And similarly with Bitcoin, the issuance of Bitcoin and the energy associated with that allows us to have Bitcoin, which provides these interesting monetary assurances to tens of millions of people worldwide. And if you look on sort of a per capita basis, and other talks I'm sure will cover this today, we're talking about disproportionate penetration in places with weak property rights, poor governance, high inflation, strong capital controls, places where people are very unfree from a monetary perspective. And so, not everyone watching this talk will be in a situation like that. Bitcoin may not be that relevant to them. But rest assured, the highest Bitcoin penetration is in places like Argentina, Venezuela, Turkey, Nigeria, Kenya. These are places where